Imagine discovering the secret behind every major market crash, bubble, and rally, but it's not politics or the economy or Wall Street manipulation. Instead, you find out that the truth hides 93 million miles away in a strange cycle of solar storms and sunspots. If that sounds absolutely insane, I was extremely skeptical too the first time I heard this theory. That was until I spent weeks digging through financial data, old NASA archives, and hedge fund research that revealed patterns that are so accurate, it's actually kind of scary. Keep watching because by the end of this video, you'll be questioning everything you know about the markets, macro, the economy, and the sun. So in my never-ending quest to solve the markets and figure out what actually causes crypto boom and bust cycles, I came across maybe the strangest and wildest theory I had ever heard. It's called the solar cycle theory, and basically it claims that all the major market moves of the past 200 years near perfectly sync up with the solar extremes in this 11-year solar cycle. And as wild and absurd as that sounds, there's actually an overwhelmingly stupid amount of evidence to prove that this is actually true. Not only that, but there's actually quite a number of professional hedge funds that use the solar cycles in their models to predict what the market's going to do next. And I know some of you guys are probably a lot like me, where you're like, this is the stupidest thing I've ever heard. There is absolutely no way this could actually be a thing. But let me just go through, just listen to the evidence, because it is absurd. It is absurd. So the way that this solar cycle works is basically the sun follows an 11-year cycle of activity, swinging from quiet lows, what's called solar minima, to intense highs called solar maxima. At solar maxima, sunspots, flares, and geomagnetic storms surge, while at solar minima, the sun is calm, quiet, and less stormy, I guess. And historically, major economic disasters and major bear markets, recessions, etc., have clustered around periods of solar maxima. So when the storm is at its highest. Where on the opposite end, prolonged bull markets often have begun at periods of solar minima, or when the solar cycle is at its calmest. For example, solar cycle 8 peaked in 1837. And this was followed by the Panic of 1837, which led to a deep recession, global commodity prices and stocks tumbling, and a severe multi-year bear market. Solar cycle 9 peaked in 1848. And this coincided with the European revolutions of 1848, which was this huge bout of economic turmoil in Europe, as well as it coincided with the US experiencing a panic as well just after this cycle. Solar cycle 10 went from 1855 to 1860. Market volatility increased as the cycle peaked. You had the Panic of 1857, as well as you had this US Civil War of 1861 through 1865. Solar cycle 11 went from 1867 to 1870. And shortly after, you had the Panic of 1873 and a long depression that contributed to a global economic collapse. Solar cycle 12 went from 1878 to 1883. This coincided with the Panic of 1884. Solar cycle 13 went from 1890 to 1893. This coincided with the Panic of 1893, one of the worst US depressions ever, where you had crashing stock prices, widespread banking failures, and then a global economic crisis. Solar cycle 14 went from 1902 to 1906. Early in this cycle, you had the stock boom of the early 1900s, which peaked in 1906. And then you had the Panic of 1907, which struck the next year after the solar maximum. During this panic, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged 50%. And then there was a recession that went from 1907 to 1908. You had the solar cycle 15 that went from 1913 to 1917. This coincided with wartime economic activity during World War I, which climaxed around 1917. And coincidentally, 1918 through 1920-21 brought a deflationary recession. Solar cycle 16 went from 1923 to 1928. Some of you guys might know this period as the Roaring 20s. And it just so happens in 1929, you had the 1929 stock market crash, which was the start of what many of you guys know as the Great Depression. Solar cycle 17 went from 1933 to 1937. And it just so happened that you had a strong economic rebound in the mid-1930s that saw the Dow Jones double from 1933 to 1937. And then the stock market peaked in 1937. And almost immediately, you saw the 1937 to 1938 crash, causing the Dow Jones to drop 50% 4%, and a sharp recession hit in 1938. Solar cycle 18 went from 1944 to 1947. Ironically, this coincided with the end of World War II, and post-World War II, you had this big economic boom. And then when the solar cycle ended in 1947 during the period of solar maxima, you had a recession and a bear market in 1948 and 1949. Solar cycle 19 went from 1954 to 1957. And the period of solar maxima during this solar cycle actually bled into 1958. So the way these solar cycles work is they don't just peak at one point. Sometimes they can hit their peak, and that peak can last for a long period of time. And so during this solar cycle, it peaked in 1957, but that peak kept sustained through 1958. And this cycle is especially noteworthy because it's one of the strongest ever recorded. And this one coincided with the US recession of 1957 through 1958, which again is the exact year you had the period of solar maxima, 1957, bled into 1958. Then you had a recession during the strongest solar storm ever recorded during 1957 to 1958. Solar cycle 20 went from 1964 to 1968, and this one also bled into 1969. And this solar cycle started with the 1960s bull market, which peaked in 1968 and was followed by a severe bear market and recession in 1969 through 1970. Solar cycle 21 went from 1976 to 1979. 1979 saw oil prices and inflation spike. Following this solar cycle, the US entered back-to-back recessions in 1980, 1981, and 1982. Solar cycle 22 went from 1986 to 1989. This coincided with one of the most infamous stock market bubbles ever. That happened in Japan. If you ever studied market bubbles, you're very familiar with this one. It was worse than the 2008 great financial crisis. It took 30 years to recover from the stock market bubble. It was so bad. And it just so happened that this bubble peaked around December 1989, coinciding with the period of solar maxima. Solar cycle 23 went from 1996 to the year 2000. This is called the dot-com bubble, which I'm sure most of you guys are familiar with. The dot-com bubble. It's one of the most infamous bubbles of our lifetime. And that happened to peak in the year 2000, perfectly lining up with the period of solar maxima. And I guess if you're not familiar with the dot-com bubble, it went way up. A lot of people made a lot of money, but then after it peaked in 2000, it went through a massive, massive collapse. Solar cycle 24 went from 2008 to 2014, and it specifically started in December of 2008. So this is kind of in the middle of the great financial crisis, after Lehman Brothers had already collapsed, but right before the stock market bottoms in March of 2009. And remember, periods of solar minima are supposed to be the start of like years of prosperity, years of like epic bull runs. And it just so happens that this almost perfectly marks the exact start of what then would become an 11-year bull run and one of the strongest bull runs in stock market history. However, unlike every single solar cycle up until this point, the period of solar maxima during this solar cycle does not directly coincide with some sort of recession or some sort of cataclysmic financial event. However, it's worth noting that solar cycle 24 is one of the weakest recorded solar cycles on record. It's also worth noting that there was a global manufacturing slowdown and market correction in 2015 and 2016. And a lot of researchers point out that we actually should have gone into recession after 2014, but because of extraordinary central bank stimulus, we likely delayed that recession, basically kicking the can down the road a couple years. And that brings us to today, which is currently solar cycle 25. And before I get into when solar cycle 25 reaches its solar maxima, I want to point out that I just went through like 200 years of history, and there is an absurd, absolutely unhinged amount of evidence to support this wild solar cycle theory, which blows my mind. When I first read through this stuff, I was like, how is this real? How is this like a real thing? And the way that this theory goes is that these solar storms subtly stress Earth's environment and like wider society. Basically, the geomagnetic disturbances that these storms cause like mess with the weather, they mess with people's mood, they mess with agriculture and like all kinds of, it's like the butterfly effect. Like it messes with all these like little things that kind of tip over into like chaos. But then also conversely, the periods of solar minima have lined up with a lot of like horrible things in history, like a lot of insane major wars. I pointed out that some of those things like lined up with World War I, World War II, and all these really traumatic events, but they also tend to be like kind of right after that traumatic event happened, which means it's usually a bullish environment because after a crazy disaster, think COVID, think the 2008 financial crisis, think World War II, you typically have a really strong recovery because prices have been suppressed so low. You typically have a really strong rebound and a really strong recovery. And there has been quite a few studies done on these solar storms and kind of how they affect people's mood and their like mental state. And there is evidence to support the claim that like these things directly affect people's mood. And during periods of heightened activity, big solar storms, typically you see an increase in hospital admissions for depression, anxiety, sleep disturbances, and overall, people's moods just tend to worsen for whatever reason. They seem to think that the likely mechanism involves geometric fluctuations disrupting the body's biochemistry. Basically, it interferes with like your melatonin regulation and your circadian rhythms and all kinds of stuff. And because you're in a bad mood and you're depressed and you're feeling down, that leads to you being like more pessimistic on the market, and it tends to kind of lead to these wider market sell-offs. That's kind of like the theory, which again, I get that. That makes somewhat sense to me. I still don't have a good explanation for why the periods of solar minima cause world wars and like, these severe, absolutely crazy events in history. The best explanation I could find is that like when solar cycles are like at their peak, you have this thing called solar wind, I guess, that blocks a lot of these cosmic rays from coming to Earth. This all sounds like it's made up out of a sci-fi novel. I swear this is true. And this typically links up with colder, stormier, more like prone for like crop failures and all kinds of bad weather things like that. And I guess there's some evidence to show that this causes changes in cloud cover, weather, and even brain chemistry. Don't ask me, this all sounds insane, but there obviously is a lot of evidence to support it. Solar cycle 25 started in 2019, reached its period of solar maxima in 2024, and it's continuing in that period of solar maxima currently in 2025 and is expected to end in mid-2025. And I'm not saying this is the cause, but we did and/are going through a pretty insane period of economic turmoil right now at the start of 2025. Luckily for us, solar cycle 2025 was predicted to be one of the weakest cycles on record, in line with solar cycle 2024, which was the weakest solar cycle in 100 years. However, so far it has been a little bit unsettling in that it's quite a bit more powerful than scientists had originally expected, already exceeding expectations by over 100%. Even with this increased activity, they still expect it to be moderately weak on the grand scale of things, unless like something absolutely insane happens in the next couple months. And I'll leave it up to you to decide what you believe about solar cycles. But it is really hard to ignore the absolutely overwhelming amount of evidence in favor of this solar cycle theory being true. If you're interested in joining the Obsidian Council, it's currently closed to new members, but you can join the waitlist in the description of this video. In the Obsidian Council, I do weekly market and macro updates. I share my entire portfolio, update every time I buy and sell. I do monthly market deep dives, weekly Q&As, and a ton more. Again, you can sign up in the description of this video. As always, none of this is investment advice. None of this is me telling you to do anything with your money. I'm just a guy on YouTube sharing the things I'm learning, thinking about, etc. You're a grown adult, act like it, and take responsibility for your own actions. As always, if this video is helpful, make sure to hit that like button. If you have any questions or comments or anything to add about this, let me know in the comment section down below. And if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and the little bell next to it to be notified each time I release a new video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.